Desperately for breath as Assad's forces renew bombing civilian areas, unleashing what looks like chlorine gas. The world stands idly by as this city, Aleppo, still home to many hundreds of thousands of civilians, is reduced to rubble and its citizens appear to be being gassed. Good evening. The weekend's G20 summit in Beijing was yet another meeting of world leaders in which hands were wrung, talks were had and good intentions were expressed. But yet again, absolutely no course of action was agreed on the war in Syria. Today, the regime bombed rebel-held Aleppo, including, it appears, unleashing the banned chemical chlorine. Our report tonight graphically describes the devastation of the city and the wholesale effort by the Assad regime to render human life there unsustainable.
Also on tonight's programme, caught on camera, the PM's plans for new grammar schools. But even the Education Department doesn't know what she thinks about the details. Sports Direct's billionaire boss tries to salvage his own reputation and his company's by promising to act on pay and conditions. So why will many of his workers miss out? And
an Islamic State stretching from China into the Middle East.
Anjem Choudary loses his liberty and his freedom to speak up for terror. He gets 5.5 years in jail for inviting followers to support Islamic State militants. We'll debate how the government should be countering radicalisation now.
And the latest in our No-Go Britain series. Going out, having a good time. But if you rely on social care, you might find yourself put to bed too early for social contact.
The first suggestion was 7. And then they were so gracious and said 8 o'clock. And then now it's kind of between 8:30 and 9.
The G20 meeting of world leaders finished yesterday. Today, doctors in Aleppo have reported that a chlorine attack has hospitalized dozens of people, most of them children. Barrel bombs that appear to have been filled with an irritant fell this afternoon in an opposition-held area in the city's southwest. Channel 4 News has received disturbing images of the chaos that followed. Fatima Manji has this report.
No older than 4 or 5 years old. Her oxygen mask slips off. She tries to fix it herself, but her hand is shaking too much. No one seems to notice. In this Aleppo hospital, there are too many other patients needing urgent help. More are brought in. Their clothes stripped off, their bodies hosed down. If it's chlorine they've been hit with, as doctors here suspect, they need to act fast. These pictures filmed for Channel 4 News show the immediate aftermath. Fearful of contaminated clothes, patients are given pink scrubs. This toddler's having his pulse checked to monitor any toxicity in his blood. He's calm, yet confused. And no wonder. How to make sense of scenes like this. The suspected chlorine attack hit Aleppo's opposition-held Sukkari neighbourhood this afternoon. Syria's second-largest city is divided by the country's bloody civil war. Rebel groups control the east, the government the west.
We were carrying one child out after another. This area is full of civilians and there's no military base around.
This, one of the canisters apparently containing the gas. A UN inquiry says the Syrian government has used chlorine gas in 2 attacks, in 2014 and 2015. It's always denied this. But if this attack is confirmed, the regime has again flagrantly disregarded international law. Doctors report at least 70 cases of suffocation today, but no deaths. The nurse asks this child's name. She's told no one knows. They took him out of the ambulance all alone. Just 2 days ago, Presidents Obama and Putin met to discuss Syria, failing to make tangible progress. And now, yet again, it's Syrian children feeling the effects of that failure.
Fatima Manji reporting. Now, those images were filmed today in Aleppo by Waad al-Khatib. The Saudi Foreign Minister Adel al-Jubeir has told this programme today that a ceasefire in Syria could be agreed in the next 24 hours. But although Mr al-Jubeir has condemned the Assad regime and the Russians for their bombing campaign, The Saudis themselves face charges of hypocrisy because of their renewed air campaign aimed at dislodging Houthi rebels in Yemen. Tomorrow, the Saudi foreign minister will urge MPs in Westminster not to suspend British arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But today, he spoke to our foreign affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, who began by asking him about the future of President Assad.
The Syrian people will not accept that a man who leads them is responsible for the murder of 400,000 people and the displacement of 12 million people and the destruction of a country. It's just inconceivable that he would have any kind of future in Syria. So the question is how to transition and when. But the transition has to take place.
What's your response to the fact that the Russians and the Americans who met recently have failed so far to negotiate a ceasefire?
I believe I wouldn't describe it as a failure. I think that it's still a work in progress. There is a possibility of arriving at an understanding over the next 24 hours or so. And then we will test the seriousness of Bashar al-Assad and his allies in terms of complying with a ceasefire like this.
But if you're a civilian in Aleppo, you dread talk of a ceasefire because every time there are talks, the bombing, and particularly the Russian aerial bombardment, intensifies.
That's correct. He has proven himself to try to be provocative and brutal in staging attacks immediately before negotiations are supposed to take place in order to make it very difficult for the Syrian opposition to come to those talks. That's been the way he has operated since the beginning of this crisis, and I personally don't think there's any reason to expect him to change.
The Russians and others could, of course, accuse you of a hypocrisy here because of the renewed bombing campaign by Saudi Arabia in Yemen. And we see that a school and a hospital were hit last month.
Well, I wouldn't say a renewed bombing campaign by Saudi Arabia. This is a war that we did not start. This is a war that was started by the Houthis and Saleh. When the talks collapsed, we have every right to defend our border, and we proceeded to do so. With regards
why are you still hitting hospitals? I mean, it seems odd that a campaign that started in March last year, you would think it would become more accurate in its targeting.
Yeah,
but you still hit 4 hospitals run by Médecins Sans Frontières.
I think that your statement is not fair. I think that your statement is not accurate. I think that your statement is biased. Would you ask the Houthis?
So you haven't hit 4 hospitals?
I will get to it in a second. Would you ask the Houthis why they deployed child soldiers? Would you ask the Houthis why they lay siege on towns and villages?
But the Houthis are not state actors. They're not a sovereign government like you.
On towns and villages, they're a combatant. On towns and villages, why they starve people, why
but Saudi Arabia must operate to a higher standard, surely.
If I may make my point.
No, but you're equating Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. And surely the point is that Saudi Arabia is a sovereign government.
No, I'm pointing out what you call hypocrisy of Saudi Arabia, I call hypocrisy of some in the media, who look at one side and don't look at the other. We have an investigation unit that we put together.
And you've investigated eight
no,
strikes?
There are more than 20 in the pipeline. Every item that we get, we look at, and we intend to look at.
And what have you discovered so far?
And we intend to be transparent about it. Read the report. Have you read the reports?
I've read the,
have you read
the
all
report
of them?
Found that only 1 of 8 strikes was down to an intelligence failure.
Okay, so we acknowledge wrongdoing like every government does. And we put in place procedures to ensure that it doesn't happen again.
But then after that report...
This is what Great Britain does, this is what America does.
What I don't understand, Minister, is that after that report, you carried on bombing targets and hit a school and a hospital.
Yeah, and we're investigating them. Now, keep in mind that the Houthis have used hospitals and schools, not as hospitals and schools, but as weapons depots. And so when you destroy it as a legitimate military target, they come back and say, oh, this used to be a hospital. Well, maybe 6 months ago it was a hospital. Maybe 6 months ago it was a school. When it was hit, the assessment that we had was that it was a military facility. Now, if it turns out to be incorrect, we will fix the problem and we will deal with it according to international humanitarian law.
Do you get any indication from your British and American counterparts that they are considering suspending selling arms to Saudi Arabia because of this controversy, or do you think it will carry on?
No, we don't get these indications. Britain and America are allies. They know how this war started. They know that we have a legitimate purpose in this war. They know we are being extremely careful in minimizing civilian casualties, and they know that we have in place a mechanism to investigate and make sure that we take procedures that prevent any repetition of mistakes from happening, just like happens in all wars.
Jonathan Rugman there. The Prime Minister had avoided spelling out her education policy, but now a photographer has snapped a confidential briefing note which makes clear ministers want to push ahead with new grammar schools. But it will only be an option in the consultation paper, and the top official at the Education Department who wrote the note says even he doesn't know what the Prime Minister thinks of the details or if the Lords will back the policy. Our political correspondent Michael Crick reports.
It's a hazard of the job. Ministers and officials are told they mustn't hold open sensitive papers while walking up Downing Street, lest they get caught on camera by a photographer who specialises in such pictures. Yet today, one more Whitehall figure fell prey, exposing a report from the top official in the Education Ministry, Jonathan Slater. Slater's memo reveals that the government's forthcoming consultative document says we will open new grammars. But Mr. Slater adds that the Education Secretary, Justine Greening, thinks this option should only be pursued
once we have worked with existing grammars to show how they can be expanded and reformed in ways which avoid disadvantaging those who don't get in. I simply don't know what the PM thinks of this, but it sounds reasonable to me, and I simply can't see any way of persuading the Lords to vote for selection on any other basis.
There are just 164 grammar schools left in England, concentrated on conservative areas such as Buckinghamshire and Kent and Trafford, where one of the MPs, Graham Brady, is chairman of the Tory backbenchers and has long campaigned for more selective schools. What does he think of today's leak?
Well, it's very hard to know what to make of a little snatch of text picked up on camera like that. But I do take it as encouragement that there is some discussion going on in government about the possibility of removing the statutory ban on new selective schools. It's a crazy ban. Grammar schools are very popular with parents. Wherever they exist, people support them, and all the opinion polls suggest that people would like to have more of them.
Jeremy Corbyn, campaigning today with the band UB40, feels so strongly about the issue, it reportedly led to the breakup of a past marriage when his wife sent their son to a grammar school.
Whilst I've often heard many Conservative politicians talk about bringing back the grammar school, I've never ever heard any Conservative politician ever call for the return of the secondary modern school. Right. Once we go into selectivity of education at the age of 11, I think that's a backward step.
But weren't grammar schools the best way for people to climb the ladder?
Some people. But what about the others that are left behind? Right.
The point is that the decision's made at 11 and it's binding, and it just seems very odd to me to decide what you're going to do for the rest of your life at the age of 11.
The law forbids any new grammar schools, but ministers are now letting existing grammars expand and even allowed this one in Kent to build an annex 9 miles away. Today's memo suggests we'll get a lot more of that. But as the top official at the Education Department warns ministers, changing the law to allow new grammars might not get through the House of Lords.
Well, with me here is Angela Rayner, Labour's shadow education spokesperson, and we're joined from Westminster by the Conservative MP Gareth Johnson, a supporter of new grammar schools. And, well, having tried to introduce them through the back door in Kent, it looks like, from Downing Street at any rate, they're going to bring them in through the front door. Is it going to happen?
Well, I certainly hope so. Grammar schools are good, popular schools. They do provide social mobility. It seems to be madness at the moment that we can have new schools that can specialise in performing arts and music, but we can't have new schools that can specialise in maths and English. We know that children are different. They all have different skills. Some have vocational skills, others have academic skills. And therefore we shouldn't be trying to create a one-size-fits-all system. We need grammar schools to help provide a diverse range of secondary school education in this country.
Right, well, so diversity and opportunity, these are the watchwords of Labour.
Well, they're not opportunistic. In grammar schools, we know that the attainment gap is wider. In Kent, it's 34%. In Hackney, it's 8%. We know that it has a tremendous effect on everybody's opportunity to raise the standards. Grammars do not work. I know that they can be popular for parents because certainly parents from my background, I come from a working class background, we want to see our kids do well, and some people think that grammars is the answer to that, but we know that the evidence is that grammars aren't the answer to that. And actually what we need to do is raise the standards in all our schools, and that's the way of delivering good educational outcomes for everybody.
And 11 is a very early age, Mr. Johnson, to determine that somebody is going to set forth on a course of action which educationally will never come anybody else's way again after that 11-year mark.
I think what this is trying to ensure is that it's horses for courses. You know, we don't seem to have any controversy associated with streaming within schools. Yet for some reason people object to streaming between schools. There doesn't seem to be a lot of logic there. If you look at comprehensives, where there's some very good comprehensives, the catchment area around those comprehensive schools tend to have very expensive houses. So you get selection by wealth in those areas. What I would like to see is more grammar schools, so there's less of a scrum around the existing one. If you have a less predictable 11 plus, then tutoring has less of an impact. And we can ensure that children do reach that social mobility ladder that we all want them to. You know, education should be about ensuring each child reaches their maximum potential. And so if you have a child that's good at education, is good at academic work, good at maths and English, then they can thrive in a grammar school environment. And we shouldn't be shutting the door on them.
What is the objection to simply raising standards for all children? Why should you segregate some particular group who can manage at 12 or 11 rather to do something which for some reason is going to be denied to everybody else thereafter?
But I believe that grammar schools can help to raise the standards in all schools. I think it's a big myth that they hold back schools in their local area. I've got 4 grammar schools in my constituency. The surrounding non-selective schools are excellent and actually more popular than some of the grammar schools.
Let me put that then to Angela Rayner.
Well, I talked about the big gap in attainment from Kent to somewhere like Hackney. We know through the London Challenge that where schools work together, the peerage and the ability to coexist together and to work with each other actually raises the bar for every child. And we know that children work at different academic speeds, and grammars just don't have that for us. There's many people that are around today that are in really good professional jobs that failed their 11 plus, and that stigma is still with them today. They've still got professional jobs, amazing people, but you know what? Grammars are not the answer, and modern comprehensive, telling children that they're failures at such a young age is terrible, and it shouldn't be condoned by any politician.
And twice, Mr. Johnson, Angela Rayner has raised this point of the difference between Kent and Hackney. Kent, 34% behind Hackney in terms of equality of opportunity as a result of having grammar schools.
Well, look, if you come to Kent, you'll see the grammar schools are hugely popular. You have many parents who would want to send their children there.
Popularity is not the question I asked you.
But
it is what it does to the educational system.
But it doesn't hold back other schools in that area. The answer here is to have more
grammar
schools,
so
there's more choice.
And you live there, you're an MP.
Yes, and what the answer is to have more grammar schools.
Why has it gone wrong in Kent?
I would argue it hasn't gone wrong in Kent. We have more
Why are the figures so bad then?
No, we have more people moving to Dartford than anywhere else around the edge of London.
Why are the figures in your county, so bad?
Let me make this point, please.
No, I'm asking you a point. I'm asking you the
questions
questions which you're not replying to. I am asking you why the figures in Kent are so bad.
But my answer is the figures in Kent aren't that bad. You have an excellent education system in Kent. You have choice. You have children who are able to go to vocational schools if that's their speciality, children who can go to schools like grammar schools that specialise in English and maths and so on. That has to be a sensible thing.
You have a two-tier system.
Yeah. And it's not a two-tier system. What it is saying that children are not all the same, and so therefore we shouldn't be
saying that the
squeezing them all
children that
into
you
one
decide
package.
are more cleverer than others will do all right and the others can rot. Because that's what the system is in terms of grammars. That's what you're saying, is that one group are elite, will pick them out the best, and the rest of them, well, they can just carry on and stay in the secondary modern or within the comprehensive system. What we need to do, surely, is around the raising attainment for all children, because we know that children learn at different levels, and that helps.
Very briefly, Mr. Johnson, we don't know what Ms May thinks, what the Prime Minister thinks. Do you know what she thinks?
I don't know. I hope there's a conversation that's going on tonight. I certainly think there will be. But I genuinely think that we have an opportunity here to increase social mobility.
OK,
we
but
can
that's
do
a point
so
you've
through
made
grammar
already.
school
But
education.
thank you very much indeed for joining us, Ms Johnson, and Ms Rayner. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Indeed. Cathy.
Thanks, John. Now, it was compared by one MP to a Victorian workhouse, but today Sports Direct published a review of its operations, promising to improve terms and conditions for its workers. It will offer casual retail staff the chance to move off zero-hours contracts onto a guaranteed working week, while warehouse staff will be paid above the minimum wage. But the deal will not apply to agency workers who make up the bulk of staff at its Shirebrook factory in Derbyshire. Our business correspondent Helia Ebrahimi reports.
Bumbling billionaire or modern-day sweatshop boss?
I really am not enjoying this.
Mike Ashley made his first attempt today at righting some of the wrongs he and Sports Direct stand accused of. In a report commissioned by the retailer, the company admitted to a long list of serious shortcomings at its sprawling warehouse in Derbyshire. The report says the board deeply regrets them and apologised for what went on. The company will now replace zero-hour contracts with guaranteed hours. It will scrap the 6 strikes and you're out disciplinary code, ensure minimum wage is paid to all warehouse staff, and employ a full-time nurse there, given the number of on-site accidents.
Mike Ashley was the founder of Sports Direct. He's the majority shareholder. It's made in his image. And he ultimately is directly accountable for the culture and practices that are in place in Sports Direct.
He's not off the hook, basically.
He's not off the hook, because actually there are no improvements that have been put in place. Yes, they're complying with the law in terms of minimum wage. I'm not going to praise any company that complies with the law, for goodness sake. We want to see a move away from this culture of intimidation and insecurity in terms of making sure that workers feel secure, because when workers are secure, they're more productive.
The outcry over working conditions was sparked by an undercover investigation. It exposed harsh working conditions, including lengthy unpaid security checks, fines for excessive chatting, and even an incident where one woman gave birth in a toilet. And while the report was full of sorries, just 3 months earlier, Ashley gave an odd series of shrugs in defence of his company's business practices.
Would you describe yourself as a kind person?
I would like to think I'm kind to the right people. I would like to think I'm kind to the genuine people. And that's not some waffly stuff. No, I don't think I'm Santa Claus. Honestly, I don't.
Just over 18,000 shop assistants at stores like this around the country will now be able to switch from a zero-hours contract to a fixed contract. The problem is that this new arrangement won't apply to the 4,000 workers in Derbyshire, which has been at the heart of most of the failings for Sports Direct.
The proposal in the report is for 10 workers a month to be transferred to Direct. That would take 28 years to transfer the existing workforce, let alone any others that come on between now and then.
Tomorrow's AGM looks like it'll be an uncomfortable experience for many of Ashley's key lieutenants, who will be facing shareholders' ire for the first time since the scandal broke.
The relationship between Sports Direct and its investors is tense at the moment. There have been issues around the company's performance, continuing issues around corporate governance, and part of those are responsibility of the CEO, and therefore we feel that now would be the right time for him to step down.
Mr. Ashley has already admitted to MPs that the firm has probably outgrown his ability to run it. With shareholders and unions baying for blood, it's likely his knack for performance will be what protects him from the same fate as his board.
Helia Ebrahimi reporting. Now, the radical preacher Anjem Choudary has been sentenced to 5.5 years in jail for inciting support for Islamic State militants. A judge at the Old Bailey said he and his accomplice, Mohammed Mazhar Rahman, had shown contempt for the values of democracy in their support and encouragement of IS. Tonight, the Home Secretary says the country is now a bit safer. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent, Simon Israel, was in court.
An Islamic State stretching from China into the Middle East.
After more than 20 years on the streets of Britain, Anjem Choudary is behind bars. The maximum sentence was 10 years for inviting support for ISIS. The radical preacher got 5.5.
That is the Islamic solution.
The judge, Mr. Justice Holroyd, told Anjem Choudary that he was a dangerous, calculating influence whose words were like gold on Twitter. You, he said, indirectly encouraged violent terrorist activity. But the combined efforts of the intelligence services and the police could never definitively link the former lawyer to even one terrorist incident at home or abroad. This was Anjem Choudary in Norway 4 years ago, surrounded by members of an al-Mujahideen-style group called the Prophet's Ummah. Many in the lineup have gone to Syria. Among them, Reza, on the far left, is an alleged ISIS executioner. Omar Chabail, just to the left of Choudary, was killed in Mosul last year. And to the right, Danish jihadi Abu Musa, also killed in Syria, and the same with Norwegians Hisham Ahmed and Egson Avdaili.
What's interesting about it is that many of the people there, half the people in the photo either went to Syria, been killed in Syria, but you know, they were the kind of leaders of all these different organisations, and I think it reflects his importance across Europe.
Islam is the fastest growing ideology and religion in the world today.
Chowdhury's relentless publicity drive drew the crowds, but made it easier to monitor, easier to gather intelligence, easier to target. Now he's gone, his acolytes are disappearing from the streets. Instead, his conviction simply moves his recruiting grounds to prisons, where many of his followers have done or are doing time. Former cage fighter Usman Raja has come across many of them. His role is to unpick the elements of their extremism, in other words, to de-radicalise.
With all of this, it's a case of you're there for as long as it takes, because this isn't a quick fix.
He says his successors include Abu Mansha, convicted of plotting to kill a British soldier, Andrew Rowe, a convert jailed for planning attacks, and Jordan Horner, found guilty of enforcing extremist values on the streets of London. What is the antidote to Anjem Choudhury's poison, then?
The antidote to the phenomenon is that we need to get a correct understanding out there, because the issue is that there's an identity, a faith identity that's been hijacked.
The sentencing of Anjem Choudhury has triggered a new prison's anti-radicalisation strategy of isolation. It's very likely that he will be located on wings occupied by lifers and those who spent years behind bars, and where his message will fall on deaf ears.
The country is a bit safer. All the evil that they have been sowing, all their evil words and the dissent they've tried to sow throughout society is over. They are paying the price and they are going to jail.
But the self-declared Islamist scholar could be out in just 2 years. He will then be under a 15-year notification period where the authorities can impose controls like bans on protests, meetings and speeches online. 9 of Choudhury's supporters chanted Allah Akbar as they watched their leader leave the dock. His imprisonment may end one threat of radicalisation, but the internet now poses so many more.
Well, Anjem Choudary has been the face of radical jihadi propaganda in this country for 15 years. But has the danger moved elsewhere, for example, the internet? And is the government's PREVENT programme intended to counter radicalisation working? Well, joining us from Birmingham is Jahan Mahmood, who was an advisor to PREVENT under the coalition government. And with me here in the studio is Sarah Khan, who's co-founder of Inspire, set up to counter extremism and gender inequality. Sarah Khan, let me start with you, because if PREVENT had worked properly, Anjem Choudary and his followers wouldn't have got half as far as they did, would they?
Well, I think it's very important to acknowledge all the positive work that PREVENT is doing, and we don't often have that discussion and debate. We know, for example, that Anjem Choudary just stood on, it was literally dancing on the law, on the line of the law. But I think let's look at PREVENT, let's see what it's done. The government has said that around 120 people have been stopped from travelling to Syria, including 50 Muslim children. We know that PREVENT has taken down 58,000 pieces of illegal material. It has worked in partnership with Muslim civil society groups across the country, many of them producing counter-narrative videos online on the internet which have had over 15 million views. So that's important work that needs to continue to happen.
Is the problem, in your view, that Prevent isn't getting the support from the community that, in your view, it deserves?
Well, I think there is a lot of support that's happening. I mean, I know numerous local Muslim organisations. We know that Prevent has engaged with around 370 mosques in the last year. It's engaged with around 385 community organisations. So that engagement is happening. Those projects are being delivered. But, of course, there's always more that needs to be done.
Well, let me put that to Jahan Mahmood. The Prevent system is a force for good, in Sara's view. Do you agree?
Well, let me ask her this question then. Why have 800 people travelled to Syria if it's working? Its outreach has clearly not worked. We clearly have an issue. The online counter-narrative doesn't come anywhere near the propaganda videos that are out there. And this is something a number of advisors have been saying for a number of years. I mean, I was one of them who said that back in 2010. Since then, it's just amplified and got a lot worse. The government took its eye off the real issue, and I'm afraid Prevent has lost its credibility in the Muslim community, for which reason its outreach programme hasn't worked too well.
Prevent has lost its credibility. That's damning, isn't it?
I would disagree with that. And I think we need to have a fair and honest discussion. There are many groups, including in Birmingham, that Jahan is probably familiar with, like Kick It, for example, who've come out and said they do excellent work with mosques, working with vulnerable individuals who have substance abuse, who alcohol abuse, who've been tempted to become radicalised and join Syria, who the government has supported. And groups like that have openly said, we welcome working with the local Prevent coordinator, and by not having that support, we wouldn't be doing what we are doing today.
But hasn't it become toxic now, and therefore needs to be done?
I think, Kathy, what we are not having a discussion about in this country is how has Prevent become toxic. And I've written about this in great depth in my book, which is out yesterday, called The Battle for British Islam, which looks at how Islamist organisations in this country have gone up and down the country, deliberately peddling lies and myths about Prevent. So, for example, saying things like, if you grow a beard or wear a headscarf, you will be referred to Prevent. These are absolutely false lies and myths. And all that does is actually weaken Muslim parents' support of Prevent when they can see that their children are being radicalised. It is irresponsible and dangerous.
Jahan Mahmood, I mean, those are strong words. Lies and myths about Prevent are being peddled by the community, according to Sara.
Well, if that's the case, then why is it that a number of teachers have rang me up and said that the training was very poor? Why is it that even imams have actually called me and said that they don't fare any better after the rap video, which I actually featured in for the government in 2010? So clearly it can't all be lying, and it can't all be a myth, especially the fact that we have individuals who now, because of Prevent, feel isolated, and unfortunately are looking for a sense of belonging elsewhere because they feel discriminated against. What I would like to see, and I hope that is in Sara Khan's book, that she criticises British foreign policy, which she hasn't really done over the years that I've watched her over TV and listened to some of her debates, to hold the media to account for giving people like Anjem Choudary an opportunity to speak on a national platform. This is a soapbox preacher who ended up being a national hate preacher, so the media should also be held to account. I know that Channel 4 interviewed him a number of times. Why give an individual like that the space and the time to help recruit individuals into his cause? And just one extra point. In 2014, I was on a BBC interview where they played a recruitment video by ISIS, and central to that was a young man called Nasser Al-Muthana, I believe it was. Now, why play a recruitment video? What do recruitment videos do? They recruit, and then we're bashing on Muslims, saying, well, you never do enough.
Okay,
I'm afraid this is a lot bigger than the Muslim community.
Okay, let me put that to Sara. The media has a responsibility, and the government needs to admit that Western policy has
we know that there's never
this.
been a single cause for each individual who becomes radicalised. There's a wide range of issues. But I can tell you with some of the cases that I've worked with, girls as young as 13 who've tried to leave the country to join ISIS, who have absolutely no understanding of geo-complex politics in the Middle East, who don't even understand who Saddam Hussein was or Iraq. But they've been radicalised by the kind of same Islamist ideology that Anjem Choudary preaches. And just on a final point, in your package before, you had someone talking about the issue of identity, and identity is crucial. In 2006, Anjem Choudary plastered, when he was part of the banned organisation Al-Ghuraba, he plastered bright rectangular yellow stickers across lampposts in East London saying, British values versus Islamic values. This is the point about identity. They are trying to confuse young people about identity, and we have to promote the idea of a British Islam and a reconciled British Muslim identity.
Sara Khan, Jahan Mahmood, thank you very much for joining us. John.
Now, being able to go to bed at a time that suits you is a choice most people take for granted. But when you rely on someone else for support, the decision isn't always yours to make. Many disabled people rely on social care funding provided through agencies, and it's often inflexible and limited. In the latest part of our No Go Britain series, Jackie Enajiji Williams has been to meet people who, like her, are being forced to go to bed early and those fighting to stay up late.
I love performing. It's really something I want to do in my life, so yeah. I can't hear anybody. Is anybody out there? Hey! All right, cool. It's attention that you ask for rather than the ones that I get every day where people are kind of just watching you. My name is, in the 5 seconds before I've even told you my name, you've judged me. You've decided what I can and can't do. You've judged me.
I can do whatever I want, but that's only possible if I have the right support.
Just smile and tell them that you're fireworks in the daytime. Thank you.
At home, my local council pays for a carer who helps me get in and out of bed.
I've heard that a lot, that, oh, Jackie, you're super independent. And I'm like, I'm super independent once I'm in my wheelchair. Take me out of my wheelchair and I can't reach certain things.
I have an issue. Most care agencies will only send carers until a certain time of the night. It means I'm forced to have a very early bedtime.
The first suggestion was 7, and then they were so gracious and said 8 o'clock, and then now it's kind of between 8:30 and 9.
It's a common problem for disabled people, but it can be an embarrassing one.
If somebody wants to give me like a headline slot, which is normally at like 10, 11 o'clock at night, I have to go, do you know what, can I like go on super early at 8 o'clock? Someone has a birthday party, it's the same thing. I have to kind of come, show my face, and then once it gets to a certain time, I like leave. And I think sometimes people think I'm being really rude, but I have to go because if I don't, I'm not sleeping today.
I'm not the only one who's struggling to stay up late. In Brighton, a group of people with learning disabilities are fighting for their right to party. They have the same issue as me, having to leave events early because support workers don't work late shifts. The Gig Buddies project is rebelling against that.
One of the people, Michael, that I know, was at this pub and having a few drinks, and the staff turned around and said, oh, it's 9 o'clock now, we've got to go home. And it's not fair.
Gig Buddies is where you're matched up with another person to go to gigs. You're supported.
People with learning disabilities get paired with music fans who have the same taste as them. It means everyone gets to finish their pints in peace.
Sometimes we go to the bar and the restaurant. They have something to eat there, and then go for a dance.
I went to a cinema in the Comedia, and it was Star Wars Episode 7. It started at 12, and I got home about 2:30, and I loved it.
Bahana never used to go out much, but Gig Buddies have changed all of that.
When I was younger, I did spend a lot of time at home, really down, and had some really down, dark days. So now I think I'm making up for it.
Getting out of the house means different things to different people.
This is a Bomber 7. It can be used for cycling or rambling.
Exploring the outdoors is Martin's passion. He needs support to do it and receives funding from the council.
To pay for a PA to enable me to get out and get involved in the community.
He also used social care funding to pay for therapeutic massages and gym sessions to keep him mobile.
It's not for fun. Actually going to a gym or an activity, it actually improves the well-being, both physically and mentally.
Since receiving the support, Martins needed less hospital treatments. But last year, he had a shock.
I had a review last November, and I had my budget slashed by about half.
They also took away money to pay for breaks with his assistant, which gave his family time off from supporting him at home. They suggested that he could go into a care home instead.
No, I want to be dead in a home. It's not my thing. It's cheaper to have a PA to support you to go away than it is to go into a home.
Martin's short break funding was eventually reinstated, along with some of his other support. Norfolk County Council told us that they're sorry they didn't get this right the first time, and they've recently reviewed their services. Meanwhile, I'm still trying to make the support I get work for me.
Care agencies need to understand that if they have younger clients, we are not going to bed at 7 o'clock because that's ridiculous.
In the week the Paralympics open, the world is being encouraged to think that disabled people are capable of anything. But many of us are still having to compromise our lives because of the limitations of the services we rely on.
Because technically it's your birthday too. Thank you.
That report by Jackie Enediji-Williams. And we'll be continuing our No Go Britain series tomorrow. Kathy.
Thanks, John. Now, the Labour MP, Keith Vaz, has resigned as chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee in the wake of the Sunday newspaper report alleging he paid for male prostitutes. There had been a suggestion that MPs on the committee might press for a vote of no confidence to force him out, but in the end, he went voluntarily with an apology to his colleagues. Michael Crick joins us again now from Westminster. Michael, so he saw the writing on the wall then?
Yes, I mean, Keith Vaz is the great survivor in politics, but he realised he couldn't survive this one after what was described as a very frank account of what had happened. He told the committee he was stepping down, not just as a member of the committee, but as chairman permanently. But his troubles are by no means over. Keith Vaz told me today he hopes to remain a member of Labour Party's National Executive Committee, but Jeremy Corbyn said that would be discussed at next week's meeting of the NEC, and I understand there are likely to be moves by some on the left to dislodge him on the grounds of bringing the party into disrepute. There must also be doubts about whether Keith Vaz can remain a Labour candidate in Leicester, indeed whether he could regain his seat in Leicester at the next election. Meanwhile today, Labour MPs have voted by 5-1 in a secret ballot to reinstate the system whereby they, Labour MPs, elect the shadow cabinet rather than allowing the party leader to choose the shadow cabinet as has gone on for the last 5 years since Ed Miliband changed the system. Now that decision has to be ratified by the Labour NEC and by the party conference later this month, but if it does go through, it may curtail Jeremy Corbyn's powers a bit, although he'll still have the power to decide who gets what jobs and have the power to appoint extra members if he thinks he needs them.
Michael, thanks very much. John.
Nicola Sturgeon has announced a £500 million investment fund to boost Scottish business as she sets out her government's plans for next year. The Scottish Growth Scheme will offer loans of up to £5 million to small and medium-sized companies. Speaking at Holyrood, the First Minister said that the cash injection would help boost the country's ailing economy.
9 Black Lives Matter demonstrators have been arrested after chaining themselves to the runway at London's City Airport this morning. The runway was closed and planes delayed, cancelled or diverted for several hours. The group said it was protesting against the disproportionate effects of climate change on the black community. Asad Baig reports.
London City Airport. The first flight of the day should have been the 6:35 to Milan. Instead, it was the scene of the latest direct action by Black Lives Matter UK protesters. They say it's to highlight the UK's environmental impact on the lives of black people locally and globally. The 9 all-white demonstration team managed to get to the runway by either swimming or using a dinghy. They then chained themselves together. The airport was shut down. No flights were coming in or out. 2 separate issues, racism and climate change, brought together for the first time.
Won't the protests actually detract from the issue?
How so?
That the fact that the airport's been shut down, people's flights have been missed,
Yeah.
and that will detract from the discussion where you want it to be about climate change and racism.
Well, you're here talking to me now about it, so I think that it's opened up avenues where the conventional avenues to talking about racism and racial injustice are often shut down. We need to have disruption like this to open up the avenues to talk to people about why the climate crisis is racist.
With the runway being shut for nearly 6.5 hours, what did passengers think of Black Lives Matter's latest venture into climate activism?
The protestation, I think it's a good thing. I mean, people are saying what they want, but then we're all affected.
I'm sympathetic to their cause, but I don't think they're going to help their cause too much with the general public by closing an airport.
It's not really nice for them to have taken over the airport just like that. It's inhuman.
They should just remove them, to be honest. I've got no sympathy, I'm sorry, but I've got no sympathy with these guys. They shouldn't be doing this, they shouldn't be inconveniencing the public in this manner.
This isn't the first time the Black Lives Matter movement have targeted airports. Last month, they carried out this protest at Heathrow.
There will be concerns raised about the security of the airport, how easy it was for protesters to gain access to the runway and stay there for nearly 6 hours.
Questions will now be asked of the police and why the protesters were not intercepted as they crossed a small stretch of water. Had this been terrorists and not activists, the consequences could have been serious. With this amalgamation of climate change and Black Lives Matter, will the latest message resonate with the wider public, or will it detract from the support both campaigns have previously enjoyed?
Asad Baig reporting there. Now, a taxi driver who allegedly told police he'd killed a woman and took them to a field where a body was buried has denied murder. Christopher Halliwell is already serving a life sentence for the murder of Shana Callahan, but he's pleaded not guilty at Bristol Crown Court to the murder of Becky Godden. Our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davies reports from Bristol.
He was the taxi driver jailed 4 years ago for killing Sian O'Callaghan. And today a court heard, before Sian, he'd murdered another young woman from Swindon called Becky Godden, burying her in a shallow grave where her remains lay undiscovered for years. Becky's family were in court today, including her mother Karen, whose last contact with her daughter had been in 2002. She listened quietly as the prosecution presented a picture of a 20-year-old with a troubled adolescence and a history of sex work, who, in perhaps early 2003, was abducted, killed, and then buried naked in a field. Christopher Halliwell, a former taxi driver from Swindon, appeared in the dock behind a row of empty seats. No defence lawyers were present. He's decided to represent himself. There's not the slightest doubt he killed Becky, said the prosecution, due in part to what happened in 2011 after he was arrested on suspicion of the abduction of Sian O'Callaghan, a young woman he subsequently admitted murdering. She'd been stabbed in the head and strangled. While at the location where Sian's body was discovered, it's alleged that Halliwell said to a detective, "We need to have a chat." They travelled a short distance, and then Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher gave Halliwell a cigarette and asked him, "What do you want to tell me?" Halliwell is alleged to have replied, "I'm a sick." "Is it too late to get help?" "It's gone beyond that, Chris," said DS Fulcher. Halliwell paused, jurors heard, and then said, "Another one." "When was it?" asked the detective. Halliwell replied, 2003, 4 or 5. Where? He gave a location the court heard, and then, having been asked whether he'd take the police there, replied, "Exact spot." Asked whether there were any other incidents, Halliwell replied no. "Only these two?" asked the detective, at which Halliwell is alleged to have replied, Isn't that enough? He would later climb over a wall into a field in South Gloucestershire, the court heard, pace to an exact spot and indicate where he'd buried another victim. Excavations nearby would reveal the partial remains of a body later identified as Becky Godden's. Nicholas Hagan, QC, prosecuting, at one point said to the jurors, "In light of these facts, you may very well be asking yourselves the question, why are we all here?" Well, the short answer to that, he said, is because when this defendant appeared in court and the charge was put to him, he pleaded not guilty. There was other evidence linking Halliwell to Becky's murder, said the prosecution, such as a soil sample from where she was buried, they claimed, matching a sample from a spade found at Halliwell's home. The judge, Sir John Griffith Williams, told jurors it was the prosecution case that there were similarities between the circumstances of the killing of Sian O'Callaghan and the killing of Becky Godden. But what you must not do, he told them, is assume that because he pleaded guilty to one, he is guilty of the other. The trial is expected to last 4 weeks.
Andy Davis reporting. Now, after the break, he's known to opponents as Duterte Harry, after the shoot-'em-up cop played by Clint Eastwood. Now the controversial Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte has got himself into more trouble after calling Barack Obama son of a whore. The Southeast Asian summit in Laos has been overshadowed by a row after the Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte referred to Mr. Obama as a son of a whore. He later claimed it wasn't personal, but the US team called off a planned meeting between the two men. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this report from our Asia correspondent Jonathan Miller does contain strong language throughout.
In his first foreign foray as Philippines president, Southeast Asia's new tough guy, aka Duterte Harry, has entered the ring, gloves off, and taken a swing at Obama. Infuriated by American criticism of his death squad approach to a drugs pandemic, Rodrigo Duterte gave Barack Obama both barrels last night on the eve of a regional summit. In his southern hometown of Davao, of which he was crime-busting mayor for 2 decades, Duterte had the leader of the free world in his sights.
I am a president of a sovereign state, and we have long ceased to be a colony. I do not have any master except the Filipino people. Nobody but nobody. Putang ina, mumurahin kita dyan sa forum na yan.
News of the slur reached Barack Obama in China before he flew off to the summit in Laos.
So clearly he's a colorful guy.
That's all he said. But the White House summarily cancelled a planned one-to-one with Rodrigo Duterte. The president is not the first victim of Duterte Harry's invective. The UN Secretary General was branded a son of a bitch, and the Pope, like Obama, the son of a whore. He told Catholic bishops, "Don't with me." Last month, President Duterte was all smiles with the US Secretary of State John Kerry in Manila. Not so with the US ambassador, though, who had chastised him during the presidential campaign for saying he wished he'd had the chance to rape an Australian missionary who was later murdered. In remarks to the army, he said he liked Kerry okay, but the ambassador? He's a gay son of a bitch, he opined. He annoys me. 2 weeks ago, a news conference in Davao, called by the president and attended by Channel 4 News, was peppered with profanities.
You see how they were the Filipino. You do not go out and just give a statement against a country.
He was defending his crackdown on illegal drugs, in which more than 2,400 people have now been gunned down. At the risk of being shot down, where is this going to end?
Good. That's a very good question. It's not even epidemic, my friend. It is pandemic. So what am I supposed to do as a president?
Well, not give a license to kill in cold blood, says Obama. Duterte might not want to hear that, but by this morning, the pugnacious president offered contrition of sorts, but not an apology.
He regrets that his remarks to the press have caused much controversy.
It's all overshadowed this summit, which had bigger things to talk about, like looming conflagration in the South China Sea. But Duterte Harry, the Donald Trump of Asia, hogged the limelight, recalcitrant and feeling lucky.
Jonathan Miller reporting, and I did warn you. Tonight's main news, the Assad regime in Syria has launched new attacks on civilian areas of Aleppo. This programme has obtained footage which appears to show the aftermath of barrel bombs filled with chlorine gas. Dozens of people have been hospitalised, many of them children.
More of that online and on our Facebook page, but
We will be back at the same time tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Till then, that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
good evening.